Welcome everybody, good to be with you today. Before we dive into the meat and potatoes of today's lecture, does anyone have any questions about the readings we're working through? Chapter 1 from the Ray text or the logical argumentation articles? Happy to help answer any of those questions before we move on. Steve, what's up?
For the questions on Stoogie, do you have to write a whole essay or just?
It says write in the instructions. There's no length requirement. Just say what you have to say and say it well. Okay, everybody else good? Okay. What I want to do with you today is introduce you to some of the basics of the major ethical systems. The different ways that philosophers explore the questions of what is good and what is evil, and how we make those decisions. Most people don't take a class like this, and by far, most people don't become philosophers that devote their lives to developing ethical systems. Yet, nevertheless, the systems you're going to be introduced to you today have been, in one way or another, influencing you your entire life, even if you've never heard of them. Because the way philosophy works in society is like the man behind the curtain, the man in the shadows, operating behind the scenes. Because the philosophers are the ones who teach the people, who teach the people, who teach the people, who become the teachers and the government officials and the business leaders in society. So the philosophers have their hands in the clay sculpting our world. And we often, unless we take the time to take a course like this or study philosophy, we often have no idea who is responsible for us being shaped this way. It's like gravity. Gravity was, I almost said invented. Gravity was not invented. It was discovered in the 1700s. Before then, were people still impacted by gravity? Before the 1700s, you think people were impacted? I'm getting blank stares. You think people were impacted by gravity before the 1700s, Camila? Yeah. They just didn't have a name for it. Well, today we're going to get some names for a lot of the things that have formed the way all of us have been thinking all along. Scott Ray divides ethical systems into two main families. One is non-cognitive systems, and the other is cognitive systems. Non-cognitive systems, you'll quickly find out the more you read of Scott Ray, are like his main nemesis. That's the real bad guy. Non-cognitive ethics treat moral claims, ethical claims, as if they are not claims of fact. That a moral claim cannot be true or false. That a moral claim ultimately simply reduces to something like, this song slaps. The statement, this song slaps, cannot be true or false. It just means, I like this song. Right? There's no factual claim being made. For a non-cognitivist, adultery is wrong reduces to, I don't like adultery. Okay. Well, at first glance at these non-cognitive systems, the biggest one that Scott Ray really hates is cultural relativism. At first glance, that may seem more liberating. Like, okay, you've got your things you like, and I've got my things I like. You've got your values, I've got my values. Let's all just get along. Okay. Until we realize that rape is wrong would have to reduce to, I don't like rape, and if you do, that's your business. Or child molestation is wrong would simply be, child molestation doesn't slap, but if you think it does, that's okay. Maybe that's how reality is, but we've got a big problem in society if it is that way. So when you're reading Scott Ray and he seems like kind of stuck in his ways and everybody else is wrong, you might, if he feels that way to you, maybe that's accurate. But just understand what the alternative to the kind of positions he's advocating for really is. If if there are no objective standards, then everything goes. The alternative to this are cognitive systems. And there are lots of different kinds, and cognitive systems are those systems which say, no, wait a minute, when I make a moral claim, I'm making a claim that is fact, a claim that can be true or can be false. So one family of cognitive ethical systems are known as consequentialism or teleological systems. Here's a funny sounding word. It comes from the Greek word telos. Telos means end or goal. In a teleological system, the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by the outcome of the action. What's the goal? What's the results of the action? One prominent version is utilitarianism. Now, Batman wears a utility belt. Hope it keeps his pants up better than my belt does, but I'm shaped so stupid that my pants just try to fall off all day long. On Batman's utility belt,
Teachers, please remember to use e-hall pass anytime you send the students out of the room. All students that are not in the classroom should have an e-hall pass.
Batman's utility belt, he has all the tools, all the things that are useful for him. Utility is usefulness. Utilitarian ethics is a system that says a choice is good or bad depending on its usefulness for humanity. Does it minimize suffering and maximize pleasure for the largest number of people? That's how to determine if something is good or bad. Which means the same choice, the same action by the same person can be good today and bad tomorrow, depending on the circumstance, depending on the consequence. Context is everything for utilitarian ethics. Another consequential theory is ethical egoism. What's an ego? Even that term ego, what's that mean to you? Steve?
Like viewing yourself bigger than everyone else.
Yeah, your view of yourself. And if you're an egoist, you're bigger, you're better than everyone else. Ego, the Latin word ego is just the Latin for I. In an ethical egoist system, right or wrong is determined based on what is in my best interest. Every individual should look out for his or her own best interest and not be distracted by the claims and the whining and the needs of others. This can take an extreme form. In the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher. He was a nihilist. He wanted to break free of the chains of all the tradition that held us down. And so he said, you know, among all the everyday, average, ordinary schlubs of this world, there are some of us who are Übermenschen. And Übermensch, that translates to Superman. That's where we get that term. There are some of us that are above. Some of us that are better. Some of us with the talent, the skill, and the will to power that make us superior to everyone else. And the way to become that is to focus on one's own drive, one's own priorities, one's own quest for power. And it does not matter who one needs to step over to get there. Nietzsche is very, very, very critical of and rebellious against the Jewish and Christian traditions that came before him. He hates the notion of God and Christianity. He says God is dead and we have killed him. And he thinks the worst thing Christianity ever did to society was give us this idea that we've got some sort of responsibility to care for the weak and the oppressed and, you know, the struggling. For Nietzsche, that makes us all slaves. By turning our attention away from ourselves and our own quest and coddling the weak, what we have done is we have made the entire species weaker. If we want to drag humanity out of the sewers of weakness that centuries of Christianity have flushed it into, Nietzsche says, we must then become Übermenschen, Superman. Now, Nietzsche lived in the 1900s. He was not a Nazi, but He directly influenced the Nazis. His ethics is the Nazi ethic. It doesn't mean every ethical egoist is. There are varieties of ethical egoism who say, it's not that I don't care about other people, it's that if everybody is focused on what's best for themselves, everybody's life will get better. Probably the clearest example of this would be like a hardcore right-wing laissez-faire capitalist who says, leave business alone, let the market decide, don't regulate, and let business do what it will. Hands off, hands off. And eventually, all the benefits, yeah, it's going to make some people super wealthy, but eventually those benefits will trickle down to everyone else. That may not be your stance on things, but one isn't necessarily a psychopath for holding that idea, but that's an ethical egoism, and it's a consequence-based ethics. Ethics based on the result. Often presented as the main alternative, it's still an action-based ethic. An ethics that's based on what it is you should be doing, is what's called deontology. Deontology is a duty-based ethics. That right and wrong is all about rules, laws. There are things that you are to do, and there are things that you are not to do. And our job is to figure out what those things are and to do them. Most famous name that's usually associated with this is Immanuel Kant. Kant's a philosopher from the 18th century. And he says that if you want to figure out what's right and wrong, so let's say you got a dilemma, all right? Italian like Curtis leaves class and she leaves $20 in the desk. All right, and I find it. And there's a voice in my head that says, well, give Italia her $20 back. There's another voice in my head that has a nicer tone of voice that says, the heck with Italia like Curtis. Who cares about Italia like Curtis? Put that $20 in your own pocket and get yourself something nice. So now I've got this dilemma. What do I do? Kant would say, well, here's what you got to do. You've got to think of each choice and imagine that each choice were a universal rule for everyone. So first, imagine a world where everybody kept other people's property anytime they found it. And think what that world would be like. And then imagine a world where everybody returned people's property whenever they found it. And think what that world would be like. And Kant would say, well, you don't want to live in the world where everybody keeps other people's property, but that's not why it's wrong. The fact that you don't want to live in that world shows that that world is not reasonable. And Kant would say that's why it's wrong. So the path to figuring out a reasonable ethic is to imagine that your choice becomes a universal law. And when you find it, when you find the law that can be universalized, always return property, don't kick Italia in the face, or even better, don't kick any student in the face, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal. When you find that law, it becomes what Kant calls a categorical imperative. It means it is your duty, always, everywhere, and there are no exceptions. So, when Kant was the teacher, a room full of Kant students, and he says this, surely the hands started going up, saying, but Professor Kant, what if Italia is just going to spend the $20 on meth? And Kant would say, what did I just say? There are no exceptions to the rules. Once you find the rule, it is your duty. There are no what ifs. And another hand would come up. And you'd say, yes. They'd say, Professor Kant, but what if Italia like Curtis is a billionaire and I haven't eaten in a month? And Kant would say, did I stutter? The categorical imperatives, the moral rules, are the rules always and everywhere. Kant gives no wiggle room for circumstance. If context is everything for the utilitarians, context is nothing for Kant. You do your duty. You obey the rules. So, the most common objection that is raised when someone is advocating Kantian ethics, an ethics rooted in Kant's philosophy, this is the classic one. It's you're living under the Nazi regime. Let's say you were the one hiding Anne Frank in your attic. Nazis are at the door. You open the door and the Nazis say, "Are you hiding any Jews in this house?" Now, most people, the gut reaction is the right thing to do is to lie to the Nazis. That however we justify it, lying to Nazis to protect innocent people is a good thing to do. Kant just turned over in his grave because Kant allows for no exceptions. So perhaps the biggest flaw in Kantian deontology is that it is so rigid that it doesn't match the actual lived experience of human beings. It's easier to tell with our gut that it's right to lie to the Nazis. Perhaps it's easier to tell with our gut than it is to explain why. And perhaps in a situation like this, explaining why is a luxury we don't have. Kant would say there is no why. Okay. Another common form of deontology or duty-based, rule-based ethics, probably the oldest and most common and often the default setting for many people is divine command theory. Divine command theory says that goodness is what God or the gods command, and evil is what God or the gods forbid. It is simple and straightforward. You know what is good because God has said it is good. You know what is evil because God has said it is evil. We're going to come back to this in the back half of class. Just know that a straightforward, simplistic divine command theory is not necessarily the actual position of most religious traditions, at least as understood by those who've devoted their lives to understanding the traditions. It does tend to be the default position of people of faith who have not really taken the time to explore what it is they claim to believe. We'll come back to it at the end of class, but this is the God said it, I believe it, that settles it approach to ethics. And a quick mention of a third form of deontology is called natural law. Natural law holds that there is good, there is evil, and you, and what?
And there's in between.
And there's in between. And you, Steve, by the very fact that you're Steve, that you're a human person, a rational animal with a human soul, you are designed with that law already written on your heart, already written on your soul. Mature, grow up, think, and every person can find for himself what is good. Every person can find for himself what is evil. That's how the great Roman philosopher Cicero looked at things. True law is right reason in agreement with nature. It never changes, it's everlasting. And we don't get it from a divine command. We don't get it by twisting ourselves in moral knots like Kant. We already have it. We look within and we sort of set it free. On the other side of the river. So that's on the action side of the river. there's a whole other approach to ethics that doesn't define good and evil based on behaviors and rules, but defines good and evil based on human persons, the character, the needs, the goals of human persons. It's called virtue ethics. The classic advocate of virtue ethics is my main man, Aristotle. And probably the most important advocate of virtue ethics in the last 1,000 years was Thomas Aquinas. Goodness for Aristotle are those characteristics, those elements of your character that make you better, that make you thrive as a human person, that make you most fully you. And evil, that's those habits, those characteristics, those traits that deform you, that twist you from within, that rot away at your soul. It's a very humanizing and liberating approach to ethics. If there's a main weakness to it, and yes, I'm actually using the word weakness in Aristotle in the same sentence. If there's a weakness to it, it's that if you're looking for specifics, you've come to the wrong guy with Aristotle. If you talk to Aristotle, you say, look, all right, man, just tell me, what do I got to do to be good? You know, what do I actually do? Like from 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock to 12 o'clock, Aristotle would say, go find a good person and do what he does. It leaves so much to be defined if you're used to rule-based systems. Basically, my mom said, do the shit that good dudes do. Pretty simple, works for me. Papa Plato, how about you? And that is Aristotelian ethics.
That was clean as hell. That was clean as hell.
For Aristotle, virtue, good habits, are to be found by walking a balance in between extremes. On either side of this balance are bad habits that he calls vices. You're probably more familiar with the adjective form, vicious. So, if I'm just so anxious and afraid, and I can't go out there today. I can't do it. I can't face those people. I don't want to get hurt. I'm just gonna stay in this bed, and I'll pull the sheets over my head, and the whole world can go away, and nothing will hurt me. Am I living my best life? No. I'm a coward, would say Aristotle. He's not very sensitive. Maybe I should speak to a psychologist instead of Aristotle. But Aristotle will say, you're a coward, and that is a vice. Well, the opposite of a vice isn't virtue. The opposite of vice is also a vice. It's an extreme in the other direction. I'm out for a walk, and it's right. It says, Mr. Childers, walk out, watch out, there's a semi-truck. And I go, I ain't afraid of no semi-truck. Semi-truck can't take me. Blam! I'm splattered all over the place. It's just raining bits and pieces of me all over everybody. Kenza's in the back puking. It's terrible. It's horrible. I've not lived my best life. I'm not living any kind of life at all because I was rash. Cowardice and rashness are both extremes. They're both vices. In the middle is courage. Yes, some things are worth being afraid of. That lion is worth being afraid of. But I'm going to face the lion and save the villagers anyway because I'm a man of courage. It's the middle path between two extremes is virtue for Aristotle. Virtue theorists tend to, over the centuries, have said that there are 4 cardinal virtues. 4 main virtues that everything else depends on. Most important is prudence. Prudence is not just knowing the right thing to do, but when to do it, how to do it, how much of it to do. To not jump into things without thinking things through. To know when is it the time to speak. It's not so it's good to speak the truth. It's bad to lie, but is this the appropriate time to be speaking this particular truth? You see a mother with a newborn baby. Look at my baby. Oh, that baby's ugly as crap. You might think. If you say what you think, you got a problem. Your problem's not that you're a liar. That's not your particular problem. The problem's that you're not prudent. Fortitude. Having enough confidence in yourself and your convictions that you are authentically yourself no matter what's going on around you. Not being swept by every wave of opinion and sentiment and every fad, but standing for what's right as you understand it. Justice. Giving to each what he or she deserves. Taking from none anything that you're not entitled to. And temperance. Moderation. Balance. In the Christian tradition that has embraced, at least in part, Aristotle's virtue ethics, there's often spoken of 3 theological virtues. What that means is, from certain Christian perspectives, these 3 virtues are only possible with divine assistance, by the grace of God, and those are faith, hope, and charity. Charity translates the Greek word agape, which is selfless, self-giving love. So, most famous thing Aristotle never said. This quote's all over the internet. It's even on my statue of Aristotle, but he didn't actually say it, but it describes his ethical theory quite well. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. We are built out of our choices, and when we make good choices, we build good habits, we become good people, and there is no other path. I want to come back to divine command theory. This will be the last thing we do today. I want to come back to divine command theory. And I want to point out, because it's divine command theory is probably the default approach to ethics of many people in our culture. But it's an approach that can be very problematic. And I want to shine a light on some of the problems with divine command theory. So, to be clear, what I'm critiquing here, I'm not critiquing belief in God, I'm not critiquing Christianity, I'm not critiquing the goodness of God or the notion that there is some connection between good behavior and God. What I am critiquing is the simplistic, straightforward assertion that we know what is good and we know what is evil because God has said so. What God commands is good, what God forbids is evil. That settles the issue. It could very well be that there are perfectly sound answers to the issues I'm going to raise. It may be that you'll find some of them in the textbook. Just remember, you're getting a particular Christian perspective from the textbook. The issues with divine command theory were noticed long ago. Plato wrote a dialogue in which Socrates argues with this man named Euthyphro, and Euthyphro advocates the idea that goodness is what the gods command, evil is what the gods forbid. And Socrates says, okay, Euthyphro, when the gods command something, is it good because they command it? Or do they command it because it is good? If they command it because it is good, that means that there is a source of goodness outside of the gods that even the gods themselves must bow to and recognize. If it's good because they command it, then the driving trait of the gods is not goodness but will. The gods could easily command something that we would think is horrifically evil, and it would just be good because they say so. This was already a problem in an ancient pagan polytheistic setting. It's a much bigger problem in a monotheistic setting. It's not that big a deal to envision ancient Greek gods recognizing some form of goodness outside of themselves, because there are many of them. It's a bigger problem to posit one omnipotent, all-present, infinite God, either recognizing a source of goodness outside of himself, or commanding something we would think of as evil. So that's a challenge. Another challenge is the challenge of pluralism. So we live in a society with people with many different perspectives and many different cultural backgrounds trying to live together in peace. If the standard for what is right and what is wrong, what we should do and what we should avoid, is the will of God, the problem comes up when Yaneli and Natalia and Eden and Firo and Camilla and Victoria all have different ideas of what God is and what God wants. The pluralism of our society is very clearly illustrated in this photograph of a church being built right next to a strip club.
Wow, okay.
Another challenge is the source problem. So there is absolutely nothing unreasonable about someone saying, I will obey everything that God tells me. It's a perfectly reasonable decision to make. The issue is that the vast majority of people who've ever lived have never sat across a table from God and been told anything. Almost every person who believes to know the will of God or the gods knows it because of some intermediary source. The Bible, it could be the Quran, it could be this deck of tarot cards, it could be any number, it could be dreams and visions. But every person who is making the claim that I know what is good and evil because God has told me isn't actually being quite straightforward with what's going on, unless that person is sat across the table from God or the gods. What the person is actually saying is, I put my faith in the fact that this source accurately reflects God's will, and I will obey that. There is the problem of always needing an intermediary source. There's a problem called the scandal of particularity. What the heck does that mean? So, we'll get real specific because the majority religion in our culture has been Christianity for 1,600 years, and the textbooks that you're reading are explicitly Christian. So let's look at Christianity specifically, okay? And we'll run the clock back. So let's look at the Judeo-Christian tradition. So we'll go back to the time of Abraham. So you're looking at 4,000 years ago. Okay, so Israel. This is a map of the world, and you can hardly see it on it. It's a tiny little place, all right? So God first reveals himself, Abraham, 4,000 years ago, in this tiny little place. By that time, there had been people for 250,000 years. At that time, all the people here would have no idea that Abraham in that little place existed. If it is the claim that we know what is good and we know what is evil because it says so in the Bible, does that mean that before God told Moses, thou shalt not kill, for 250,000 years, God sat back with arms crossed in silence and watched as everybody did non-stop evil and did nothing to intervene? I'm not saying there's no answer to that. I'm not even proposing that as an objection against belief in God or any particular religion. But it's a difficulty that must be dealt with if one's to advocate the simple one-to-one correspondence between what this book says is good, what this book says is evil, and that settles the matter. And there are those who do wish to run our society based on that principle. Challenge 4 is a problem of interpretation. Every text in the Bible is written in another language, another culture, very different from our own. It's not always easy to understand what it means. The Bible itself says this book is not easy to understand. There's a second letter of St. Peter in the New Testament in which he says, hey, the things that St. Paul's writing, which is also in the New Testament, is really tough to understand. And ignorant people distort and misunderstand it to their own destruction. So the book itself says this is a difficult book to understand, and if you don't understand it right, you're going to be destroyed. So before we can advocate for a straight one-to-one correspondence between what is good and what the book says is good, we need to solve the challenge, the problem of interpretation. What's going on in this picture? Argument? Okay, who's doing the yelling here? Papa's doing the yelling. Who's yelling at?
The kids.
Oh, the kids. So what gets you yelled at when you're these folks' age? Because you guys, I don't know if you know it, but you guys are these folks' age. So what gets you yelled at?
Doing certain stuff.
Doing certain stuff.
Getting bad grades.
Getting bad grades.
No,
Have you ever, Ian,
not being loved?
do you ever find yourself at home and copping just the tiniest little bit of attitude? Does that ever happen? Giving your parents just a little bit of attitude? It's weird, it's weird. Yeah, is that, if any of you, Camila, you ever have a little bit of attitude with your parents? You know, the tiny little bit? Any attitude sometimes? Andrea, you actually might not. No, even Andrea gives attitude to her parents sometimes, right? Yeah. Well, check this out. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 to 21. If someone has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders at the gate of his town. They shall say to the elders, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the town are to stone him to death. You must purge the evil from among you. All Israel will hear of it and be afraid. Now, the fifth challenge and the biggest one to a straightforward divine command theory that we know what is good and what is evil directly from the sacred text is the problem of evil commands. And a reminder, none of this is a critique of belief in God or religion itself. It's a critique of a simplistic divine command theory. But now you might say, wait a minute, hang on. Hey, if God commands you to kill your son, well, what God says goes. And so if he says it's good, it's good. To which I can only say, you've disqualified yourself from the conversation. The opinion of someone who thinks it's good to murder their children for copying attitude. A, none of us would have lived as long as we have. And B, that person just has no more to contribute to the discussion of what good is and evil. Now, I'm not the first person to discover this verse and the other evil commands in here, and it's not as if Christians have been going around stoning their children to death for 2,000 years. So I am sure there are many, many reasonable ways to handle statements like this in the scriptures, but things like this must be addressed if we're going to have a conversation that includes the perspective of divine command theory, that what this text says is what should go, and that's how we should form our society. And there are those who want to form our society based on that exact principle. Okay. Hopefully you're not ready to stone me to death yet. I do remind you, all your textbooks are written from an explicitly Christian perspective, and that makes my job now to present other perspectives in class. Anyone stone me, or should we call it a day?
I'm gonna stone you.
Steve's gonna stone me. All right. I shouldn't get. I'm not allowed to get stoned on the job. Steve,
Oh,
sorry.
right.
Oh.
That's all I need from you today. Thanks, Ken. The rest of the time is yours.
Now we can stone. There you go. You got it.